Oh, okay. So, good day, everyone. This is me again, Shalami Nino, your discussant for today's topic. So, now we are going to discuss the diagnostic assessment in language classrooms. So, as future teachers, we have to bear in mind that making assessment is important on assessing our students. So the first purpose of assessment is that teachers need to do assessment in order to diagnose. So we call that as diagnostic assessment. So what is diagnostic assessment? So diagnostic assessment is the use of a tool such as a test to determine the knowledge and skill level of a student prior to a lesson. So why do we call this as a diagnostic assessment? So why? So when we go to the doctor, your doctor will diagnose your illness. Um, he or she will check out what's the problem, will see what's wrong with you. So that's the same as the diagnostic purpose of assessment. So why do we need to diagnose? So we need to diagnose in order for us to determine the weakness of our students. So the first one is that we have to check on what's wrong with our students, or meaning we need to understand those preliminary learnings of our students and the prerequisite knowledge um about a certain subject that we are going to teach. So which the students did not catch up during the previous school year or to the previous topic. So let's cite an example. So for an instance, your subject is English. So you're going to teach your students to construct sentence. So but then again, the prerequisite of or the prerequisite knowledge with the lesson sentence construction is that they should understand subject verb agreement. So therefore it is very important that you diagnose first whether your students have weakness um, in those prerequisite lessons about sentence construction. So meaning, do they really have enough knowledge about subject verb agreement? So can they really identify nouns, pronouns, verbs, and other parts of speech? So is there a problem with their understanding about that certain topic? So that's the weakness that we have to target first so that they could be able to understand our topic, which is subject verb agreement. So aside from the weakness, aside from looking into the weakness of your students, we also check out their strength. So why is there a need of a strength? So why do we need to know about a certain topic? Again, why do we need to know their strength? So because when teacher exactly knows what students know and don't know about, they can focus onto the lessons or the topic that students still need to learn about rather than what they already know, because it is time consuming if the teacher will focus to the topic that the students already know rather than the subjects that are needs to be focused on. So by this means, this cuts down on students' frustration and boredom. So when we do diagnostic assessment, we also need to check out the strength of the students. So take note that the diagnostic assessment is not meant for grading. So it is a kind of a tool for the teacher to know or to be able to assess the weaknesses or the strength of their students. So next is, what is the purpose of diagnostic assessment? So diagnostic assessment examines what is wrong and give interventions in case there are some weaknesses which will result rather from your diagnosis. Next, provides information to individualize instruction. So it may show a teacher that a small group of students needs additional instruction on a particular portion of a unit or course of study. So he or they can then provide remediation for those students so that they can fully engage with new content. Um, Similarly, if teacher discovers that a group of students has already mastered a large portion of unit of study, so he or they can design activities that allow that group to go beyond the standard curriculum for that topic through independent or small group study. So finally, it creates a baseline for for assessing future learning. So it shows both the teacher and the students what is known before instruction has occurred. Thus, it sets a it sets a baseline on a topic. So as the students move through the instruction, they can see what they are or aren't the teacher could see or could measure what they know or what they don't know. So to be able to assess if they are learning or not. And the teacher can provide remediation or enrichment as needed. Next, so when do we do a diagnostic assessment? So when we say uh, so again, to answer the question, when do we do diagnostic assessment? So of course, before instruction or before teaching the lesson. So when we say that before instruction, it's before you teach the lesson or before you teach the topic. Okay? So just like what you said, just like what we have said earlier, example is about sentence construction. So before they change the lesson, you should give diagnostic test first. In order for you to determine again the prerequisite knowledge which is needed in construction sentences. Because if there are problems with that certain matter, so there will be problems when you teach or when you are starting to teach the lesson. So even if how good teacher you may be, even if how master or even if how good teacher you are, but if your students fail to acquire those prerequisite knowledge that is needed or that are required for the subject that you will be teaching, they will never understand nor catch up the lesson that you are teaching. Because again, the prerequisite knowledge is required to proceed to the another topic. So again, note that there is a difference between formative assessment and diagnostic assessment. So, we conduct formative assessment after a specific lesson, while the diagnostic assessment, it is done to measure if the students has a prerequisite knowledge um on the other subject matter. So again, as what I have said earlier, your student will never understand nor catch up the lessons that you are teaching. So all your efforts will become futile. So it means all the efforts that you have exerted on that specific lesson, it will become useless. So first, you should start diagnostic assessment so that before you will teach the main lesson, you will be going to you will be going to teach the prerequisite knowledge that are needed. So before proceeding to the another topic, you need to reteach again so that your student could acquire the prerequisite knowledge that is required for the students to understand your lesson. So I know that some of you would react or would say that um, it is a waste of time or very hago kayo sa part sa teacher. But take note that you will always bear in mind that what do you want as a teacher, or what would you like to happen? So would you like your students to understand you or not? So if you do not want that you'll be understood by your students, so the only way to do is that you need to make sure that all the prerequisite knowledge required for your lessons that your students are already know. So again, so the only point the only point of time that you can say that your students are ready to learn new lesson is that they already acquire the prerequisite knowledge. So meaning these diagnostic assessment also have the purpose of preparing your students. So where are you preparing your students? Of course, to your lesson. Okay? So that is diagnostic assessment, and I hope that I'm making a sense here. Next is the characteristics of diagnostic assessment. So let us now take a shift to this matter, which is the characteristics of diagnostic assessment. So do we have here we have here the various sources of diagnostic interference. So identifying sources of discrepancies from expected performance or characterizing patterns of errors can be diagnostically useful. So one common source of diagnostic is a vertical discrepancy in performance for determining student state of knowledge is a specific in specific learning expectation. So in this way, diagnostic feedback can direct students to specific points in learning. So diagnosis based on a vertical discrepancy requires the developmental theories of language learning. So this vertical discrepancy um, requires the developmental theories of language learning. So this can be found in mastery oriented of language proficiency such as CFR or common reference global scales. So content experts, including teachers, are often involved in the standard setting procedure used to determine criterion levels based on expectations of primary for target domains. The standards make learning expectations explicit. The result performance categories are expressed on the mastery oriented proficiency scale. So, for example, the CFR includes six references levels such as basic, independent, proficient, and so that's it. The basic, independent, proficient. So, in fact, detailed performance level descriptors are diagnostic rather than the performance category label. So the PLDS or the PLDs provide a description of students' knowledge and skills within each performance level and can facilitate teachers' diagnostic judgment about students' mastery status. So in classroom, a mastery criterion level can be set at any point of instruction wherever teacher need diagnostic information about students' mastery status instead of relying on final end of term performance. So next is the further issues in diagnostic assessment. So, how do we determine the level of specificity, and make what makes task more or less diagnostic? Okay, so this includes how to determine the level of specificity. So an important step in designing diagnostic assessment is defining and specifying the primary diagnostic criterion specific to a learning context. So diagnostic assessments tend to assess a target range of skills at a time instead of covering a wide range of skills. However, a too narrowly specified skill specifications may be pose problem resulting from a gross simplification of the reality of cognition. So, how do we then strike a balance? So, according to what has been stated by Miss Levy, 1995. So note that the level of detail at which students' competencies are differentiated needs to be determined based on pedagogical consideration. So that is can be a specified detail direct students learning. So there is no absolute true level of specificity for diagnostic criteria. So thus the level of specificity serves the diagnostic purpose and instructional goals in a given learning context. So we may begin designing diagnostic assembly by asking these questions. Next, we have what makes task more or less diagnostic. So diagnostic assessment tasks should investigate a unique part of language learning to gather useful information about students' language profiles. So um, is static taxonomies of content specification are not sufficient for creating diagnostic task that reflects the dynamic and sequential nature of diagnostic assessment. So diagnostic tasks requires a microanalysis of learning behavior, level of cognitive difficulty, and learner's background characteristics. So if tasks with extreme difficulty levels fail to elicit students' cognitive processing, the the effect of diagnostic feedback may remain limited because the learner may be unconscious of the diagnostic feedback, or unconscious for the problem solving process, or because difficult tasks overload enough to evoke conscious deliberation, may be good candidates for designing a diagnostic assessment. So next is the agency in diagnostic assessment. First, we have the teacher's diagnostic assessment competence. So in a daily basis, teacher prefer to use questioning, observations, and frequent quizzes to understand what students know and do not know. Research shows that teachers often do not design and implement such activities with diagnostic assessment in mind and spend a small amount of time assessing individual students. So, most teachers commence their careers with relatively less training and assessment issues than other subject specific domains. So it is undeniably true, no, na some of the teachers is not so good on making or constructing assessment. So lots of teachers jud dili jud ka-deny. Dili sa panghinaway pero tinuod jud pud na. So again, going back to the topic, um, assessment topics and pre-service and in-service teacher training programs are elective rather than core curriculum. So for example, on the first day of my graduate level my graduate level assessment course, I heard a student, also a full-time secondary school teacher saying, I did my pre-service teacher program right here. I did my pre-service teacher program that at this institution have taught students since then, and I'm head of the history department at my school, and I am passionate about my teaching, but still I have no idea what is good assessment practice and how to tell what my students need are in systematic and far ways. So she is not alone. Many teachers express their desire to develop the diagnostic assessment competences. So the ability to assess students' learning process, um, interpret the results from various sources of assessment, and intervene the areas of improvement for individual students. So one way to develop teachers' diagnostic assessment competence is through their systematic reflections of learners' performance, guided by relevant knowledge in a diagnostic assessments affords teacher the opportunity to target their students' specific needs and promote curricular renovation. So um, teacher education programs should integrate assessment into their core curriculum to promote teachers' assessment competences, and to make their own professional judgment based on evidence gathered from assessment. So next agency is student as a change. So one crucial assumption about the beneficial effects of diagnostic assessment on student learning concerns students' views about diagnostic information and their rules in making changes. So, research shows that not all students are uses similar strategies in processing their language skills to solve tasks. So if diagnostic assessments measures only known skills and strengths, but fails to incorporate multiple pathways to completing given tasks, so the resulting diagnostic outcomes may be of a little use. So that is according to the study of Anderson in 2007. So students from different sociolinguistic and cultural backgrounds are more likely to approach tasks differently, which makes it difficult for assessors to anticipate all pathways. So students tend to react to diagnostic feedbacks by comparing it with their own self-assessment and decide whether or not to focus their learning on the areas of improvements. But regardless of whether or not students' self assessment is reliable and accurate, students' beliefs about the own competencies should be consulted in tailoring instructional interventions and evaluations or evaluating the effect of diagnostic feedback. Or we also have Young's report that when there's self-assessment in when self-assessment is incongruent with the dialang assessment results, students tend to pay more attention to feedback. So she further notes that students' normative beliefs about the purpose of assessments also affect their reaction to feedback. So while the focus of diagnosis is students' cognitive competence, so the parameter, so this is the parameter of diagnostic assessment involves um, more than cognitive dimensions. So the view of students as change against in diagnostic assessments should consider non-cognitive learner characteristics. So positive learning outcomes attributes to formative feedback are correlated with students' attitude to learning, especially mastery learning. So especially or more research is necessary for understanding what non-cognitive variables media students use of diagnostic feedback for improving their own learning. So that's that's all. But let's have first our takeaway of this topic. So the task is not simple, but we can succeed. We will surely be on the way to developing responsible postmodern language testing. So we began to pay full attention to the nature of diagnostic assessment and to experiment with its potential to bring close theories of language learning and assessment. So in closing, the three main areas of diagnostic language assessment to reach its full what do you call this one? Full um fusion wala siya in the next 10 years. First, teachers and students will play central roles in diagnostic assessment. So diagnostic assessment signals a shift from testing for selection to assessment for learning. And this in return brings forward teachers and students as critical agents of assessment. So future research needs to focus on how to increase teachers' diagnostic assessment competence and develop students' autonomy because it is very vital. Second, research on diagnostic assessment will contribute to developing various theoretical models of language ability and vital for characterizing what to diagnose. So while there are competing theories of language ability, we do not know much about their viability for diagnostic assessment. So fully functional models of language development for diagnosis require a micro-level analysis for both cognitive and non-cognitive characteristics of language learning taking place in the classroom. So we will be benefiting from active classroom research that experiments with various theoretical models of language development and provides a thick description of learners' language use. And lastly, the principal diagnostic assessment design will contribute to enhance the quality of diagnostic assessment in language classroom. So existing excellent test design frameworks such as evidence centers center design can guide research on diagnostic assessment, construction, and validation. So, furthermore, the principles can help us develop criteria for evaluating the quality of diagnostic assessment tasks. So, students' deep thinking process should be microanalyzed to understand how tasks elicit their processing skills. And diagnostically rich tasks are likely to evoke students' conscious deliberation. And also, diagnostic assessment is not a simple task, yet, the complexity that it illustrates and the promise that it holds for teachers and students are compelling argument for future research. So that's all. I hope you understand our lesson for today.